19th of March, 4th Sunday in Lent. Sermon on John chapter 9 verses 1 to 41. In the Gospels we read of many miracles performed by Jesus. In John's Gospel he calls them signs. He places them so that they augment and inform a passage of Jesus' teaching. This story in our Gospel reading today gathers entirely around a healing sign, the giving of sight to a man born blind. It occurs during the Festival of Light. It's a remarkable story told in unusual detail. Even more remarkable, though, is the perfidy of the Pharisees, who would not accept the testimony of their own eyes, or the testimony of the man himself, preferring to remain in spiritual blindness. The story concerns a man whose only resort to earning a living was to beg, because he was blind. It was a pitiful existence, sitting, hoping for a few coins, but often ignored. Judged too. Even the disciples, who should have known better, asked Jesus who had sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind. It's always easier to seek a reason to blame someone for their own misfortune. It offers an excuse to walk past. People say it about the homeless. Oh, they're on drugs. Yes, they may well be. So might we, if we had to sleep in shop doorways. But drugs or not, they deserve help if we can offer it, without judgment. Jesus soon scotched the disciples' idea, though. There's no record of the blind man asking for his sight, but Jesus, the light of the world, made some mud, spread it on the man's eyes, and told him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. The man did so, and light flooded into his eyes. He could see. The miracle should have testified clearly to anyone that Jesus had extraordinary power. However, immediately people began to doubt. No, it's not the blind man, just someone like him. Even when the man himself spoke up and insisted that he was indeed the man who had sat begging because he'd been born blind, the crowd still asked how then had his sight been received. A man called Jesus, well, where is he? And the man didn't know. That was when the Pharisees were called in, for, shock horror, it was the Sabbath day on which the man had been healed. Immediately the Pharisees declared that whoever had healed the blind man could not be from God, because he was not keeping the Sabbath commandment. This was by no means the first time that the Pharisees had had a set-to with Jesus about healing on the Sabbath. Earlier in John's Gospel, Jesus had healed a crippled man, as a result of which the Pharisees sought how they might kill him. Later, Jesus justified his reasons for healing on the Sabbath, but now here we are again with the hypocritical Pharisees, this time refusing even to admit that healing had taken place. They questioned the man and then called his parents to testify. The parents confirmed that this was their son, who had been born blind. But they refused to be drawn further into the argument, for they were in fear of the Pharisees, who had threatened to expel from the synagogue any who acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah. This is an extraordinary point in the story. The Jews had been waiting for centuries for their Messiah. Belief in and longing for the Messiah was a sum total of the Jewish faith. The Pharisees of all people should have been in eager expectation of the Messiah, for they knew the Scriptures thoroughly. And yet, when a man appeared, performing deeds that only the Messiah could do, they shunned him, denied him, sought to kill him. Was it that they were so entrenched in their Jewish way of life, so focused on keeping the law meticulously, so proud of their status, that they'd lost sign of the very purpose of their religion. They should have seen and heeded the signs. Had not their prophet Isaiah spoken more than once of the eyes of the blind being opened when the Messiah came? How could the Pharisees not see? Not willing to give up, the Pharisees called the man a second time, now challenging him to own up and acknowledge that he had been healed by a sinner. However, the man stood firm. He didn't know who had healed him, but he knew for certain that he had been blind and now could see. When the Pharisees continued to question him as to how his healing had occurred, he lost patience and challenged them. "Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to be his disciples?" So it sounds as if he'd started to understand who the man was who had opened his eyes. That retort enraged the Pharisees. They claimed for themselves discipleship of Moses, but denied all knowledge of who Jesus was and where he had come from. They seemed content to remain living in the past. The man who had been healed seemed suddenly to have gained confidence and conviction. God doesn't listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. At that, the Pharisees accused him of being born entirely in sin, reverting to the question of the disciples at the start of this account. Did this man sin that he was born blind? How could anyone sin in utero? But that is what the Pharisees claimed, and they drove him out, expelling him from fellowship in the synagogue. The poor man could have been in a most desperate situation, but Jesus found him and revealed himself as the Messiah, the Son of Man. The man believed and worshipped him. Within the hearing of the Pharisees, Jesus said that he had come into the world to give sight to the blind, but that some, in rejecting him, would choose spiritual blindness, and he levelled that accusation at the Pharisees. This story sets the scene for Jesus' famous teaching on the Good Shepherd, in which he contrasted himself with the false shepherds, the religious leaders of Israel. It's clear throughout that passage that he had the Pharisees in mind. His teaching harks back to the prophecy of Ezekiel chapter 34, describing bad shepherds who had not strengthened the weak, healed the sick, bound up the injured, brought back the strays, sought the lost, but with force and harshness had ruled them. Those words describe almost exactly the way in which the Pharisees had treated the man who had been born blind, badgering him, threatening him, refusing to accept his testimony, and finally expelling him. There's a strong warning for us Christians in this account of healing. Are we, like the disciples, quick to seek excuses, not to help the vulnerable? Might we, like the Pharisees, deny that someone is equipped by God because we disapprove or feel threatened in some way? Might we express doubt at some work done in God's name? When I was first a Christian, I read and accepted the words in several of Paul's letters that women must not teach. I failed to see that this advice was societal, based on the fact that in those times women were not educated or in any way prepared for leadership. However, I came across two women who were clearly anointed, an Anglican vicar and a Baptist minister. Each was so gifted that it would have been absurd to deny that God had called and equipped them. And so when I myself was called to preach, I had no reservations in recognising that God had called me and would equip me accordingly. It's the same way in which I have reconsidered Paul's words regarding homosexuality. There are just too many gay Christians who are clearly anointed by God. John Bell of the Iona community is just one. His songs have enhanced so much of our worship. How could we dismiss him as a sinner not belonging to God? I want to quote Bruce Milne from his commentary on John. He says, "Whenever we find ourselves valuing the letter of God's word above its spirit, whenever we find ourselves unable to rejoice in the saving and renewing of lives, simply because the instrument used was not someone who dots all the I's and crosses all the T's of our theological group, whenever we lose the daily, hourly sense of joy in the grace of God, by which we alone know him and live before him, then we need to beware." Self-righteousness and condemnation of others is so common in our world and such a blight upon it. Jesus set his community ablaze with his attitudes that were so very different from the usual pattern. He refused to reject, to condemn, to exclude. He sets us a wonderful example of how to be Christians. Let us follow in his footsteps.